Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from all around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content, so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. I'm back. I am sorry this isn't the episode that you were expecting this week. Unfortunately, life does get in the way sometimes, and to be completely honest with you, my audience who have maybe tuning in for the first time or are long-time listeners, sometimes life really does get in the way, and I personally am struggling with real severe burnout at the moment. So I'm forcing myself through it. I'm trying to get there for you. So thank you so much for bearing with me, and please continue to bear with me whilst I work through this. And I'm sure I will release the expected episode to catch up at some point when I'm feeling a little bit better. But moving away from the dreary and focusing on the good parts, let's hop on over to our monster of the week, which is quite a funny joke, hop on it, and you will come to realise that later with the context of this monster. So yes, we are heading on over to China to look at the terrifying but slightly funny Jiangshi. The Jiangshi are described as an undead vampire or zombie-like monster from Chinese folklore. They are both male and female, with pale but furry white skin, which can also be green due to the mould and decay growing on their body. They have extremely long tongues, long black fingernails that are sharpened and pointed, and they generally walk with their arms outstretched like a stereotypical zombie. This is because they are dead, and they've settled long into rigor mortis, where the body becomes stiff in death and all of the muscle seize up. And because of this, they're unable to walk properly, which means they do tiny hops to move around. Hence the joke earlier. You can usually find Jiangshi wearing the traditional Qing dynasty official wear, which is often a uniform-like coat and a round-topped hat, so you could definitely spot them in a modern-day crowd. They cannot think, see, hear or speak, but are able to smell, which tends to lead them to their meals. In fact, it's said if you don't breathe around them, they might just walk straight past you. Speaking of meals, they are considered vampiric, but not in a traditional way of blood-sucking, although they sometimes did also do this. They would absorb a person's ki, or life force, to survive, which would make them a little bit more terrifying, and they were completely ravenous for it. They are found throughout China, and would only be found during the night, as during the day they would rest in coffins, or dark places such as caves or forests to protect themselves from the sun. And that leads us very nicely onto powers and weaknesses, where they do have quite a few of both. It's said that they are able to fly, as well as generally being super strong and durable, and pretty much immortal until they are actively destroyed, much like a stereotypical vampire. For weaknesses, again, as all vampires, they have a weakness for picking up lots of small objects as a mean of distraction, the sun, and fire. But Jiangshi are also scared of their own reflection, and a rooster's call as it implies the morning is coming. They also have a fear of anything made from the wood of a peach tree, as peach is the essence of the 5 elements within Chinese mythology, which deters evil spirits, as well as a 15cm piece of wood nailed to the bottom of a door, which should stop them from entering your house. 2 more very unique ways to stop them coming in are by nailing jujube seeds into the back of the corpse, as these are natural acupuncture points, and makes them completely stop in their tracks. And lastly, and probably most commonly, is a Taoist talisman called Fulu, which is a piece of paper with a spell written on it in chicken blood to banish the spirit back to the underworld, which is usually nailed into their forehead, and very often in media you will see them with this little tag on their forehead as well. But how do you prevent a Jiangshi from even existing? Or how do you become one? There were a few ways to become a Jiangshi, such as a necromancer raising your dead body, if you were possessed by an evil spirit in life, or if you committed suicide or were murdered, so died in an unnatural way, quote unquote. You could also become one if your good energy, or hun, was outweighed by your evil energy, or po. If this happened, all of the good energy would leave your body in death, and the po would take over to cause chaos. You could also become a Jiangshi in a very specific way, which is if you are not buried after your funeral straight away, then your coffin is struck by lightning and then is jumped over by a black or pregnant cat. You would become one. But I think that criteria is pretty exact, and there are some very specific steps here that I think are probably quite unlikely to achieve. So let's hop on over with the Jiangshi to etymology. And we actually have an exact translation for this one. Jiang literally means hard or stiff in Chinese, and shi means corpse. So Jiangshi literally means stiff corpse. However, they do have another nickname that I can only find in English, which is the Chinese hopping vampire, based on how they move about. So if you see this reference anywhere, they are referring to the Jiangshi with this. But it's very literal and of course relates to the rigor mortis and the stiff movements of their body. For their history, they do again have a very clear background, which I appreciate whilst researching at least. The Jiangshi roots go all the way back to the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, who ruled from 221 BC to 210 BC, obviously under the Qin dynasty, and during this rule established all of the Chinese land. However, this meant that many died under his banner at war and far away from home, and so transporting the bodies back to families was a really hard task, and of course it was super expensive. Another really important note here is that there is and was a really big taboo in China and other East Asian countries that the dead must be buried, and as quickly as possible. It was believed that corpses, if left unburied and exposed to the elements, such as the sun and the moon whilst outside, would be able to absorb the universe's energy and reanimate as these ravenous undead, which we now know are the Jiangshi. So, a lot of families couldn't afford this transport of their loved ones' bodies, and would try and figure out other methods of getting them home, as the Chinese at this time believed that they should be buried with family, so that their souls don't get homesick and just wander alone. Initially, in this early era of the Qin dynasty, there is a myth that they would hire Taoist priests, who would use a ritual to reanimate the bodies, and actually teach them to hop home, with the priests themselves guiding them at night, where they would ring bells to warn the local people not to look out, as it is considered bad luck for a living person to see a Jiangshi. Of course, this one is considered myth, but it's still quite a nice link back. Much later on though, in the Qing dynasty, between 1644 and 1911 AD, the same kind of thing was happening. Labourers would travel for construction work, and due to extremely high mortality rates, their bodies would also need to be transported home. Therefore, they created a way to get these bodies home safely, where they would be arranged upright in a single file and tied to long bamboo rods on their sides and carried by two men. But the way that this looked was that it was a hopping effect, where the whole load of them would be moving, and probably looked a bit like a foosball table setup. There were also other methods, such as where one man would carry the corpse on his back and would cover him and the corpse with a large robe and a mourning mask, whilst the other person would walk ahead with a lantern and tell the corpse carrier of any obstacles because they couldn't see. They would also generally travel at night to avoid people seeing them, but also the cooler air would help with the stalling of decomposition, and of course, the horrendous smell of death. There are two really fun history points here too. One is that you may have noticed I've brought up the Qing dynasty before, and that's because the Jiangshi are known for wearing Qing dynasty official clothing. But why is that? Now, this is believed to be a dig at the Qing officials during this time in history, because China at this point was split into different ethnic groups, with the largest being the Han Chinese, and the powerful, such as the emperor himself, the Manchu. The Manchu were deemed as barbaric by the Han, and forcefully tried to get them to abandon their cultural practices and traditions, usually with violence or bloodshed. Therefore, the Jiangshi were given this look to represent a visual depiction of that violence and injustice. However, of course, a lot of time has still passed since then, so it is surprising that they have managed to maintain this look in modern day folklore as well, and it may just be a complete reclamation of that cultural barbarity. There is also the belief that Jiangshi were cover-up boogeymen, made up by smugglers who would transport bodies illegally, not entirely sure what for, and I don't want to know, and they generally wanted to scare off the locals and, of course, any law enforcement. But really interestingly, Jiangshi are still really prevalent within Chinese folklore, even with practitioners of Feng Shui still changing actual Chinese architecture to include that 15cm piece of wood to door frames, which is still commonly found in Chinese architecture. They are also really commonly used in Chinese media, fiction and cinema, which I've got a whole load of suggestions for later too. In regards to similar monsters, of course we have the European vampire as an easy comparison, but we also have the Haitian zombie, which is where all Western zombie depictions and adaptations derive from, and the Jiangshi were probably the closest we've ever come to a zombie on the show, with the outstretched arms and shuffling walk. However, there is enough of a vampire overlap to sit really nicely in between these two massive mythological monsters. Of course, I've covered vampires before. I'm yet to cover the Haitian zombie, and I plan to at some point for a special, so do keep an eye out. Now, let's hop on over to modern media. Surprisingly, there are a lot for the Jiangshi, but of course they are mostly Asian media, so if you're used to watching these, you might know some of them. But for art, I would really recommend looking at independent art this week, because there's not really much around typical Jiangshi portraits that we would usually see. So do go and check out your local artists or any independent stuff. I really recommend it, and they are pretty cool. In movies, we have Hopping Mad, the Mr. Vampire sequels, Asian Dynamite, Crazy Safari, Fantasy Mission Force, The Jitters, Kid from Kawatung, Kung Fu Wonder Child, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, Our Friend Power 5, The Shadow Boxing, Swift Shaolin Boxer, Vampire vs Vampire, and Zombie 56. For TV, we have Forever Night, Blood Ties, What We Do in the Shadows, Juken Sentai Geki Ranger, Chuju Sentai Live Man, Gremlins Secrets of Mogwai, Jackie Chan Adventures, Kung Fu Panda Legends of Awesomeness, My Life as a Teenage Robot, 3 Delivery, Spookies, Dragon Ball, Rosaria plus Vampire, and Shaman King. In video games, we have ones such as Abyss Crossing, The Battle Cats, Age of Mythology, Castlevania Order of Ecclesia, Darkstalkers, Super Street Fighter 4, La Mulana, Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, RuneScape, Zombies Run, Endless Nightmare, Splatoon, Gaia Online, Kung Fu Chaos, Metal Slug Attack, Paper Dolls, Super Mario Land, Overwatch, Splatoon, Demon's World, Touhou Project, Kingdom Hearts 2, Vice Project Doom, Super Chinese Fighter, Ghost Lore, Spelunky, Putty, The Legend of Silk Road, Phantom Fighter, Kung Fu Kid, Sleeping Dogs, Flying Warrior, and Genshin Impact. My book recommendations this week are for vampires, From Dracula to Twilight, The Complete Guide to Vampire Mythology by Charlotte Montague, and The History of the Vampire in Popular Culture, Love at First Bite by Violet Fenn for vampire mythology. But for Chinese folklore, have a look at Chinese Myths and Legends, Tales of Gods, Heroes and Monsters by various authors, and that one is actually due out in September, so get your pre-orders in. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? Unfortunately, just like all the vampire monsters that we have covered before, it is most likely a no, I'm afraid. To add to that, the extra zombie influence does also add some more crazy supernatural bits that are a bit more unbelievable to it, making me a bit more sceptical than usual. What I love about this monster though is that history and how rich it is behind it. The interesting idea of having all of these corpses that aren't buried from poor families rotting in the sun, but the contrast of that, absorbing that energy and then reanimating just to get home, is kind of wholesome in a way, but it's also quite cool. It's definitely different in regards to the spreading of the vampire/zombie virus, which we see in modern media for all of these monsters, so I'm glad that it's not spread through to this, and it does make them stand out a lot more. But that background of just trying to get bodies home to their family is really nice, and I think it's a different take on any monster. And does that really make the monsters if they just want to walk home and be buried in their family plot? I mean, they still want to eat our life energy, which does sound worse than blood. So I'm pretty sure they're still monsters, but I don't think those priests that brought them back thought about that side effect when they thought it would be a great plan to just walk them home. I do wonder how many of those supposed priests were probably eaten along the way. But either way, I think it's a really interesting one. But what do you think? Did the Jiangshi terrorise ancient China? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. I think it was a really interesting monster. It was really nice to finally cover a zombie-like monster, rather than just that normal generic vampire one. And I'll be honest, we've covered so many ones like Menanangal and the Penangalang, where it's that pregnancy type vampire in these parts of the world, and it's quite nice to have something different as a vampire itself. As I said, I will be covering zombies on a wider level at one point as a special, so do keep your eyes open for that. It'll probably be next year, but it should be a really good one, and I'm really excited to cover them in more detail. Next week though, we are heading over to the Alpine region of Europe, which apparently is a separate thing, to look at a magical dragon with poisonous breath from the Renaissance era. So come figure out if they're a snake or a dragon with me, with the Tattleworm next Thursday. For now though, thank you so much for listening, and for bearing with me once again. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. And you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.